The morning of
I
Miss
am
Vivian
Hercule
Ashworth's
Poirot.
wedding dawned with that
Welcome to my
peculiar
new
clarity
mystery story.
that sometimes precedes momentous events, as if nature herself wished to provide a perfect backdrop for what should have been the happiest day of a young woman's life. I had not intended to attend the ceremony at all, having only a passing acquaintance with the bridegroom, Mr. Reginald Thornfield, through my club. However, a chance encounter the previous week had resulted in a pressed invitation and my somewhat reluctant acceptance. St. Bartholomew's Church in the village of Millbrook Cross stood like a medieval sentinel among the rolling Cotswolds hills, its ancient stones weathered to a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. The wedding party was to be a grand affair, bringing together two of England's most prominent families. Miss Ashworth, daughter of the late textile magnate Sir Edmund Ashworth, was marrying into the Thornfield banking dynasty, a union that had been the subject of considerable society speculation for months. As I approached the church that morning, I observed the usual collection of wedding guests, ladies in elaborate hats consulting their watches with increasing frequency, gentlemen adjusting their morning coats, and the inevitable photographers positioning themselves for the perfect shot. The atmosphere buzzed with that particular energy that accompanies significant social events, where every gesture and glance carries weight beyond its apparent meaning. What immediately drew my attention, however, was not the assembled company, but rather an extraordinary vehicle stationed near the church entrance. It was an antique funeral carriage, painted in deepest black and polished to a mirror shine that seemed almost theatrical in its perfection. The carriage bore the distinctive characteristics of Victorian mourning coaches: heavy curtains at the windows, ornate brass fittings, and an overall design that spoke more of solemn processions than joyful celebrations. "Rather an odd choice for a wedding, wouldn't you say?" remarked a voice beside me. I turned to find Dr. Hensley, the village physician, whose acquaintance I had made the previous evening at the local inn. "Indeed," I replied, studying the vehicle with growing curiosity. "One might almost call it ominous." Dr. Hensley chuckled, though there was little humor in the sound. "Mrs. Ashworth insisted upon it. Family tradition, she claimed, though I've never heard tell of such a custom. The carriage belongs to Dace & Son, the local undertakers. They've had it restored specially for the occasion." As we spoke, the wedding party began to emerge from the church following the ceremony. The bride appeared radiant in her grandmother's lace, her face glowing with happiness as she accepted congratulations from the assembled guests. Mr. Thornfield, a solid-looking gentleman in his 30s with the bearing of a successful businessman, seemed equally pleased with the proceedings. I observed the other members of the wedding party with the casual interest of a long-time observer of human nature. There was Mrs. Caroline Ashworth, the bride's stepmother, a handsome woman in her 40s whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Mr. James Whitmore, Thornfield's business partner, hovered near the couple with the air of a man calculating profit margins even at a wedding. Miss Dorothy Ashworth, Vivian's youngest sister, watched the proceedings with an expression I could not quite decipher. Was it happiness for her sister, or something more complex? The maid of honor, Miss Celia Darnley, seemed unusually agitated, constantly adjusting her bouquet and glancing toward the black carriage with what appeared to be genuine apprehension. When I mentioned this to Dr. Hensley, he nodded grimly. "There's been talk," he said quietly. "Anonymous letters, warnings about the marriage. Nothing specific, mind you, but enough to set nerves on edge." The most intriguing aspect of the arrangement was the ritual that followed the photography session. Mr. Dace, the undertaker, a thin, precise man with the demeanor of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations, approached the carriage with a red ribbon and a stick of sealing wax. Before my astonished eyes, he proceeded to seal the carriage door with the ribbon and wax, creating what appeared to be an unbreakable closure. "Another family tradition," Dr. Hensley explained, noting my expression. The bride travels alone to the reception, sealed in the carriage to ensure her purity and protection during the journey. Quite medieval, if you ask me, but Mrs. Ashworth was adamant. The coachman, a weathered man named Hucknell, whom I learned had been specially engaged for the occasion, assisted Miss Ashworth into the carriage. Through the window, I caught a final glimpse of her radiant smile as she settled herself among the dark velvet cushions. The door was closed, the ribbon applied, and the red wax seal pressed firmly into place while dozens of witnesses looked on. The procession set off with considerable ceremony. The black carriage, drawn by two magnificent black horses, led the way along the winding country road toward Thornfield Manor, where the reception awaited. The remaining guests followed in a convoy of motor cars, myself among them in Dr. Hensley's reliable but ancient Austin. The journey should have taken no more than 20 minutes along the well-maintained road. The carriage maintained a steady pace, never stopping, never deviating from its prescribed route. Several guests in the following cars commented on the picturesque sight it made against the green countryside, though I confess the funeral aspect of the conveyance continued to strike me as singularly inappropriate. We arrived at Thornfield Manor to find the black carriage already stationed before the main entrance, the horses standing quietly in their traces. Mr. Thornfield, who had travelled in the lead motor car, approached the vehicle with obvious pleasure, ready to assist his bride in making her grand entrance to their reception. What happened next will remain etched in my memory until my dying day. Mr. Dace stepped forward with appropriate solemnity and broke the red wax seal, which had remained intact throughout the journey. The ribbon fell away, and the carriage door swung open to reveal nothing. The carriage was completely empty. Miss Vivian Ashworth had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Her bouquet lay on the seat, the flowers already beginning to wilt. Her gloves rested beside it, carefully placed as if she had simply decided to remove them, but of the bride herself there was no trace whatsoever. The carriage had been sealed. The journey had been continuous and observed. The door had remained locked throughout, yet somehow, impossibly, the bride had disappeared from what amounted to a locked room traveling at 15 miles per hour through the English countryside. In the confusion that followed, the frantic searching of the grounds, the questioning of the coachman, the examination of the carriage itself, one fact became increasingly clear. This was no ordinary disappearance. The circumstances defied rational explanation, and the local constabulary, while well-meaning, seemed entirely out of their depth. It was Mrs. Ashworth who first suggested consulting a specialist. "I have read," she said with remarkable composure considering the circumstances, "of a Belgian gentleman in London who has achieved considerable success in cases of this nature, a Monsieur Hercule Poirot." As I stood in the gathering dusk, staring at the empty carriage that had somehow swallowed a bride whole, I found myself entirely in agreement with her suggestion. If ever there was a case that required the application of those famous little grey cells, it was surely the mystery of the bride in the black carriage. The immediate aftermath of the discovery plunged Thornfield Manor into a state of barely controlled chaos. Inspector Pierce, summoned from the village constabulary, arrived within the hour to find a scene that defied his considerable experience with rural crimes. The wedding guests, their festive mood utterly shattered, clustered in nervous groups throughout the manor's reception rooms, speaking in hushed tones and casting frequent glances toward the windows that overlooked the accursed carriage. Mr. Thornfield moved through the house like a man in a waking nightmare, his earlier joy transformed into something approaching madness. He would stride to the great windows, stare fixedly at the black carriage standing in the drive, then wheel about and demand that the search be expanded to neighboring counties. His business partner, Whitmore, attempted to manage the practical concerns with what I could only describe as unseemly efficiency, fielding telephone calls from London newspapers while simultaneously directing the dismissal of caterers and the preservation of evidence. The family members themselves presented a fascinating study in contrasting responses to catastrophe. Mrs. Ashworth maintained an almost supernatural composure, her hands folded precisely in her lap as she sat in the library's highest-backed chair. When Inspector Pierce attempted to question her about the sealed carriage tradition, she answered with perfect courtesy, though I noticed her gaze never quite met his directly. There was something in her manner that suggested she was not entirely surprised by the evening's events, though I could not have articulated precisely what gave me this impression. Miss Dorothy Ashworth, the bride's younger sister, alternated between periods of genuine distress and moments of almost startling clarity. Her grief seemed authentic enough, yet I observed that she recovered from each bout of weeping with remarkable speed, immediately launching into detailed recollections of her sister's happiness and radiant appearance at the ceremony. Dr. Hendley, who had remained at the manor to assist with the medical aspects of the crisis, mentioned privately that Miss Dorothy's reactions struck him as somewhat theatrical. The maid of honor, Miss Darnley, had excused herself early in the evening, claiming severe headache brought on by shock. When I encountered her briefly in the upper corridor, she appeared genuinely distressed, though her anxiety seemed focused less on grief for her missing friend than on some unnamed fear. She spoke repeatedly of the anonymous letters that had preceded the wedding, wondering aloud whether they had contained specific threats that had been overlooked or dismissed too readily. As the night wore on, Inspector Pierce conducted a thorough examination of the carriage, though his growing frustration was evident with each passing hour. The vehicle yielded no secrets to his methodical investigation. The interior measurements matched the exterior dimensions exactly, ruling out any hidden compartments. The floorboards were solid, the walls intact, and every surface bore the undisturbed patina of age and careful maintenance. The red wax seal, broken cleanly by Mr. Dace's knife, showed no signs of tampering or previous disturbance. The coachman Hucknell, a weathered man with the steady demeanor of one accustomed to handling difficult horses and demanding employers, repeated his account with unwavering consistency. He had not stopped once during the journey from church to manor. The road had been clear, the horses well behaved, and the carriage had maintained a steady pace throughout. When pressed about possible stopping points or moments when his attention might have been diverted, he grew increasingly indignant, insisting that 30 years of professional driving had taught him to notice everything that occurred around his conveyance. It was well past midnight when Mrs. Ashworth approached me with a proposal that would transform the entire nature of the investigation. "I've been considering our situation," she said with that same unsettling composure, "and I believe we require assistance beyond what our local authorities can provide. I've read of a Belgian gentleman in London, a Monsieur Hercule Poirot, who has achieved remarkable success in cases of this extraordinary nature." The suggestion was acted upon immediately. A telephone call was placed to London, and by morning a response had arrived. Monsieur Poirot would take the earliest available train and arrive at Millbrook Cross Station by 11:30. His brief message requested that nothing be disturbed and that all members of the wedding party remain available for consultation. Poirot's arrival proved to be an event that seemed to restore a measure of order to the chaos that had engulfed Thornfield Manor. He stepped from the hired motor car with the precise movements of a man accustomed to making strong first impressions, his appearance immaculate despite the early morning journey from London. His famous mustaches were in magnificent condition, and his small, neat figure radiated an air of supreme confidence that immediately commanded attention. He acknowledged Inspector Pierce with courteous professionalism, though I detected a subtle assessment in his keen eyes as he evaluated the local officer's capabilities. Without preamble, he requested to examine the scene, asking that he be permitted to conduct his initial observations without interruption or commentary. His approach to the black carriage was methodical to the point of ritual. He circled the vehicle slowly, his head tilted at a slight angle, missing nothing in his comprehensive visual examination. He noted the position of the broken wax seal, the angle of the hanging ribbon, and the precise placement of the bride's abandoned gloves and bouquet within the interior. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "Now," he announced, straightening his already perfect posture, "I shall require to speak with each member of this household individually. The truth, mes amis, lies not in the physical impossibility of this disappearance, but in the very human motivations that have created such an elaborate deception." Poirot established his temporary headquarters in the Manor's morning room, arranging the furniture with that meticulous precision that had become legendary among those who knew his methods. He positioned his chair to command an optimal view of both his subjects and the accused carriage beyond the windows, while ensuring that anyone seated opposite would find themselves subtly disadvantaged by the afternoon light. The transformation of the cheerful morning room into an instrument of psychological investigation was accomplished with such quiet efficiency that even Inspector Pierce seemed impressed by the Belgian detective's methodical approach. His first interview was with Mrs. Caroline Ashworth, who entered with the same unnatural composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. Poirot rose to greet her with elaborate courtesy, his manner suggesting both respect for her position and a subtle challenge to her remarkable self-control. She settled herself in the appointed chair with practiced elegance, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture that spoke of years of careful social training. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of gentleness and steel that had unnerved so many before her, "you have endured a most terrible shock. The disappearance of your stepdaughter under such extraordinary circumstances must cause you considerable distress." Mrs. Ashworth inclined her head gracefully, though I noticed her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against her gloves. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, Vivienne was very dear to me, despite what some might assume about the relationship between a stepmother and her husband's daughter. I have cared for both girls since their father's death 5 years ago." Poirot made a small notation in his leather-bound notebook, though his green eyes never left her face. "The sealed carriage ceremony, this was your suggestion, was it not? A family tradition, I'm told." For the first time since the crisis began, Mrs. Ashworth's composure showed the slightest crack. The pause before her response lasted perhaps a second too long, and when she spoke, her voice carried a defensive note that had not been present before. "It was indeed a tradition in my own family, Monsieur Poirot. My grandmother spoke of it often, though I confess it had not been practiced for many years. I thought it would add a touch of romantic mystery to the occasion." "Romantic mystery," Poirot repeated thoughtfully, his head tilted at that characteristic angle that suggested deep consideration. "And yet the choice of a funeral carriage for such a purpose strikes one as somewhat macabre, does it not? Tell me, madame, had you perhaps discussed this tradition with Mr. Dace before the wedding day?" The question struck home with visible impact. Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something that might have been fear or perhaps guilty knowledge. "I may have mentioned it in passing when making the arrangements. These old customs require proper explanation, you understand." Following Mrs. Ashworth's dismissal, Poirot took the unusual step of examining the carriage once more, this time with the concentrated attention of a man who had begun to perceive patterns invisible to others. He circled the vehicle slowly, his small, neat figure moving with deliberate precision. I observed him testing the door mechanism, running his fingers along the window frames and breathing deeply near the velvet cushions as if seeking to capture some elusive scent. "Orange blossom," he murmured to himself, faint as a memory, and something else. Something that speaks of preparation, of forethought. He sighed, lifted the bride's abandoned gloves, weighing them in his palm with the concentration of a jeweler examining precious stones. The bouquet received similar attention, though what secrets it might have yielded remained locked within his remarkable mind. His interview with Miss Dorothy Ashworth revealed layers of complexity that transformed her from a grieving sister into a young woman harboring deep reservoirs of resentment and frustrated ambition. She entered the morning room with obvious reluctance, her earlier theatrical grief replaced by genuine nervousness that manifested in rapid speech and contradictory statements. "We were not as close as sisters perhaps should be," she admitted, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers with increasing agitation. "Vivian was always the favored one, you understand. Beautiful, accomplished, destined for a brilliant marriage. I sometimes felt quite invisible in comparison." Poirot's gentle questioning revealed that Dorothy had been experiencing significant financial difficulties, having invested unwisely in a theatrical venture that had collapsed spectacularly. The family's wealth, while substantial, was not unlimited, and Vivian's marriage to Thornfield would have secured Dorothy's position as well as her own. When pressed about her knowledge of the anonymous letters, Dorothy claimed complete ignorance, though her manner suggested depths of knowledge she was reluctant to explore. "You were present, mademoiselle, when these letters arrived?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "I may have seen one or two," Dorothy replied quickly, then caught herself. "That is, I was told about them. Vivian was quite upset, though Caroline insisted they were nothing but spite." The interview with Miss Celia Darnley proved particularly illuminating, though in ways that added complexity rather than clarity to the mystery. She entered the morning room with the bearing of someone approaching an ordeal, her earlier headache apparently forgotten in the face of more pressing concerns. Under Poirot's patient questioning, she revealed romantic feelings for the bridegroom that went far beyond mere friendship. "I have known Reginald since childhood," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "When he announced his engagement to Vivian, I thought my heart would break. But I would never have wished harm to come to her. She was my dearest friend, despite everything that I felt." What emerged from Miss Darnley's testimony was a picture of the wedding morning that differed significantly from the accounts provided by others. According to her, Vivian had seemed unusually agitated during the preparation, asking repeatedly about the sealed carriage ceremony and expressing doubts about the wisdom of the tradition. She kept asking whether it was truly necessary, Miss Darnley explained, her voice taking on a note of something approaching accusation. She said it made her feel like she was being prepared for burial rather than marriage. But Mrs. Ashworth insisted the tradition was essential, that to abandon it would bring terrible misfortune upon the union. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot conducted brief consultations with the other members of the household. Mr. Thornfield's grief appeared genuine, though his frequent references to the financial advantages of the marriage struck an oddly mercenary note. Mr. Whitmore's clinical detachment provided a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the others, his primary concern seeming to focus on damage control and the practical implications of the scandal. The coachman Hucknall and undertaker Dace repeated their accounts with unwavering consistency, their stories aligning perfectly despite Poirot's subtle attempts to uncover contradictions. The carriage had been sealed, the journey had proceeded without interruption, and the bride had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. When Poirot finally concluded his interviews, he sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, his fingers steepled before him in the gesture that had become synonymous with his deepest concentration. The patterns were beginning to emerge, though the central impossibility of Vivian's disappearance remained as bewildering as ever. Whatever thoughts occupied his remarkable mind during those moments of reflection, they were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Pierce, whose expression suggested that the mystery was about to acquire yet another dimension of complexity. "Monsieur Poirot," the inspector announced with barely concealed excitement, "we have discovered something that may change everything. A groundskeeper at the church has come forward with information about the morning of the wedding. It appears that someone was observed near the carriage before the ceremony began. Someone who had no business being there." Poirot's response to Inspector Pierce's announcement was immediate and decisive. He rose from his chair with that characteristic precision that marked all his movements, his green eyes sharpening with interest while his expression remained carefully controlled. "Ah, but naturally we must speak with this groundskeeper at once," he declared, already reaching for his hat and gloves. In cases such as these, Inspector, it is often the smallest observations that illuminate the greatest truth. The journey back to St. Bartholomew's Church provided an opportunity for reflection that Poirot utilized with his customary thoroughness. As our motor car wound through the Cotswold countryside, he maintained absolute silence, his head tilted at that familiar angle of deep concentration. I observed him studying the route with renewed attention, noting the various curves and dips in the road that might have provided concealment or opportunity for any number of purposes. The church grounds appeared different in the afternoon light, somehow more austere and forbidding than they had during the morning's festivities. The ancient stones seemed to hold secrets within their weathered surfaces, and the very air carried a weight of expectation that made our small party speak in hushed tones as we approached the vestry. Mr. Rudge, the groundskeeper, proved to be a man whose appearance spoke eloquently of decades spent in careful observation of his domain. His face bore the deep lines of one who had weathered many seasons, and his pale eyes held the shrewd intelligence of someone accustomed to noticing details that others might overlook. He approached our group with obvious nervousness, his cap held respectfully in his gnarled hands. Yet there was a dignity in his bearing that commanded immediate respect. "'Twas about 8 o'clock in the morning," Rudge began, his voice carrying the measured cadences of rural England. 3 hours before the ceremony proper, when the mist was still clinging to the yew trees, I was tending to the path near the vestry, same as I do every morning when I noticed someone by the black carriage. Poirot listened with the concentrated attention of a musician following a complex score, occasionally nodding to encourage the groundskeeper's narrative. Under his patient questioning, a picture emerged that added yet another layer of complexity to an already bewildering mystery. "A lady, I'm certain of it," Rudge continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "Tallish, but light on her feet, moving with purpose around the carriage. She wore dark clothing, a heavy cloak or shawl that concealed her features, and she seemed to know exactly what she was about. Not fumbling or uncertain, you understand, but working with the efficiency of someone following a well-rehearsed plan." "And what precisely was this lady doing, Monsieur Rudge?" Poirot inquired with particular emphasis. "She was working at the door, sir. Had something in her hand, looked like a cloth or perhaps tissue paper. She was rubbing at the window frame, then the door handle, very methodical-like. When she noticed me watching from the path, she gave a little wave as if she belonged there, then slipped away quick as you please around the side of the church." The groundskeeper's account proved remarkably detailed under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning. The mysterious figure had worked for perhaps 5 minutes in total, moving with obvious familiarity around the carriage and demonstrating knowledge of the church grounds that suggested either long acquaintance with the location or careful prior reconnaissance. "The scent, Monsieur Rudge?" Poirot asked with deceptive casualness. "Did you notice any particular fragrance?" Rudge nodded emphatically. "Violets, sir, strong as a greenhouse, and something else, something sharp that reminded me of the theatre in Cheltenham when they're preparing the scenery. Chemical-like, if you take my meaning." Following this interview, Poirot conducted a methodical examination of the area where Rudge had observed the mysterious activity. His search of the gravel and surrounding vegetation yielded several items of potential significance. A small square of tissue paper bearing a brown, gummy residue that carried a distinctly theatrical odor, and a fragment of black silk caught on a rose thorn near the vestry wall. He examined these discoveries with the concentrated attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts, holding the tissue paper to the light and testing its texture between his fingers. The brown substance proved to be some form of adhesive or theatrical preparation, while the silk fragment was of excellent quality and bore a faint trace of that same orange blossom scent he had detected in the carriage. "Inspector Pierce," Poirot announced after completing his examination, "I believe circumstances require a second, more thorough interview with Mr. Dace." His earlier account, while consistent, may have omitted certain details that seemed insignificant at the time, but now appear crucial to our understanding of events. The undertaker's establishment received us with the same dignified courtesy as before, though I detected a subtle change in Mr. Dace's demeanor. Where he had previously displayed professional confidence, there now seemed to be an underlying tension, a wariness that suggested he had been anticipating our return. Poirot's approach to this second interview demonstrated the psychological subtlety that had made his reputation throughout Europe. Rather than confronting Dace directly with Rudge's testimony, he began with seemingly innocuous questions about the morning's preparations and the specific requirements that had been communicated regarding the sealing ceremony. "The morning of the wedding," Poirot observed with casual interest. "You arrived early to position the carriage, did you not? And during this time you perhaps received additional instructions or clarifications regarding the ceremony?" The effect of this question was immediate and revealing. Dace's carefully maintained composure showed visible cracks, his hands moving nervously among the papers on his desk. The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds before he found his voice. "I am not certain what you mean, sir. My instructions were quite clear from the beginning." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes fixed upon the undertaker with unwavering intensity. "Mr. Dace, I think you understand very well what I mean. Someone visited you on the morning of the wedding. Someone who provided very specific additional details about the sealing ceremony. This person was not Mrs. Ashworth, was it?" The undertaker's resolve crumbled with startling suddenness. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was not Mrs. Ashworth, but I was sworn to absolute secrecy, you understand. Professional discretion demanded complete confidentiality in the matter." "Professional discretion," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Or perhaps professional survival. Tell me, Mr. Dace, what exactly were you asked to do, and by whom?" The story that emerged from Dace's reluctant confession transformed the mystery from an impossible disappearance into something far more calculated and sinister. The morning visitor had indeed provided specific modifications to the sealing ceremony, alterations that were presented as safety measures designed to protect the bride during her journey. These changes, Dace revealed with obvious reluctance, involved the application of a special preparation to the carriage door mechanism. "I was told," Dace concluded miserably, "that revealing these arrangements would result in considerable unpleasantness for all concerned. The person who visited me possessed knowledge of certain irregularities in my business practices, irregularities that could have resulted in the loss of my license and the ruin of my family's reputation." Poirot's expression grew grave as the implications of this revelation became clear. "Mr. Dace, you will now tell me exactly what modifications were made to that carriage, and you will tell me the name of the person who demanded them." As the undertaker began his detailed confession, I realized that what had appeared to be an impossible mystery was revealing itself as something far more elaborate and malevolent. The bride in the black carriage had not simply vanished through supernatural means. She had been made to disappear by someone with intimate knowledge of both the wedding arrangements and the vulnerabilities of those involved in executing them. The sealed carriage had been nothing more than an elaborate stage prop in a drama whose final act was yet to be revealed. Yet even as these revelations unfolded, I could see in Poirot's expression that he was not entirely satisfied. There were still pieces missing from this puzzle, elements that would require his particular genius to uncover and arrange in their proper order. The game, as he was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, but its ultimate resolution remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Mr. Dace's confession emerged with the halting reluctance of a man unburdening himself of a secret that had grown too heavy to bear. Under Poirot's patient but relentless questioning, the undertaker revealed that his mysterious visitor had indeed been a woman of obvious breeding and education, though her identity had been carefully concealed beneath a heavy veil and dark cloak. She arrived just as the morning mist was lifting, Dace continued, his voice growing steadier as the words flowed. Spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to having her instructions followed without question. The modifications she requested were specific and technically precise, suggesting considerable forethought and planning. The alterations, as Dace reluctantly detailed them, were ingenious in their simplicity. The carriage door's sealing mechanism had been modified to create what amounted to an elaborate stage illusion. A second set of sealing materials had been concealed within the carriage itself, along with a small knife designed to cut the original ribbon from the inside. The wax seal, while genuine, had been applied to a decorative stud rather than the actual locking mechanism, creating the appearance of security while permitting access. The lady provided theatrical adhesive, Dace admitted, producing a small vial from his desk drawer. This was to be applied to ensure the replacement ribbon would adhere properly and appear aged. She demonstrated remarkable knowledge of such materials, speaking of them as one familiar with stagecraft. Poirot examined the vial with his characteristic thoroughness, noting the distinctive odor that matched the residue found on the tissue paper. His green eyes sharpened with interest as he considered the implications of such specialized knowledge. "And the identity of this lady, Mr. Dace? Surely you observed details that would assist in identification?" The undertaker's hands trembled as he reached for a handkerchief to wipe his perspiring brow. "The perfume was distinctive, Monsieur Poirot. Violets, very strong, and when she removed her gloves to handle the materials, I observed her hands. Well cared for, with a particular ring on the left hand, a mourning ring of jet and gold." Inspector Pierce's sharp intake of breath indicated that he, like myself, immediately recognized the significance of this detail. Mrs. Caroline Ashworth wore just such a ring, a memento of her late husband that had been remarked upon by several wedding guests. Our return to Thornfield Manor was conducted in contemplative silence, each of us absorbed in the implications of this revelation. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the estate grounds, and the black carriage stood like an accusation against the gathering dusk. What had begun as an impossible mystery was revealing layers of human calculation and deception that spoke to motives far more complex than mere criminal opportunity. Poirot's confrontation with Mrs. Ashworth took place in the same library where she had maintained her remarkable composure throughout the crisis. This time, however, subtle changes in her demeanor betrayed the strain of maintaining her facade. Her fingers moved frequently to adjust her mourning ring, and her earlier perfect poise had acquired a brittle quality that suggested it might shatter under sufficient pressure. "Madame," Poirot began with his characteristic blend of courtesy and steel, "I believe circumstances now require complete honesty between us. Your visit to Mr. Dace was not the casual mention of family traditions that you described. It was a carefully planned consultation regarding specific modifications that would facilitate your stepdaughter's disappearance." Mrs. Ashworth's response was immediate but measured, her voice carrying the controlled tone of someone who had prepared for this moment. "Monsieur Poirot, I will not insult your intelligence by denying that I sought to protect Vivian. The marriage troubled me deeply, though I could not express my concerns without appearing to be the interfering stepmother of popular fiction." "Protect her from what, madame?" "From making a mistake that would have destroyed her happiness," Mrs. Ashworth replied, her composure beginning to crack. "I had learned certain things about Mr. Thornfield's character, his business practices, that convinced me Vivian was walking into a trap. But she was so radiant, so convinced of his devotion, that she would not hear a word against him." The story that emerged painted a picture of mounting desperation and misguided maternal instinct. Mrs. Ashworth admitted to authoring the anonymous letters, hoping to create sufficient doubt to postpone the wedding. When this strategy failed, she had conceived the plan involving the modified carriage as a means of removing Vivian from immediate danger while providing time to expose what she believed to be Thornfield's true nature. "The plan required Vivian's cooperation," Poirot observed, his tone suggesting he had already deduced this crucial element. "She could not simply vanish without her knowledge and consent." Mrs. Ashworth nodded reluctantly. I finally convinced her on the morning of the wedding, showed her documents I had obtained regarding certain financial irregularities. Vivian was horrified, but the arrangements were too advanced to cancel without creating a scandal that would have ruined both families. The mechanism of the disappearance, as Mrs. Ashworth explained it, had been elegantly simple despite its elaborate preparation. At a predetermined point along the route where the road curved through a wooded area and the following cars would be momentarily out of sight, the carriage had paused briefly. Vivian had used the concealed materials to cut the original ribbon, applied the false seal, and slipped away to a waiting motor car that Mrs. Ashworth had positioned nearby. Yet even as this confession provided answers to the central mystery, I could see that Poirot remained deeply troubled. His expression suggested a man who had solved one puzzle only to discover another lurking beneath its surface. The disappearance had been explained, but something in the overall pattern continued to disturb his remarkable mind. "Your plan was indeed ingenious, madame," Poirot said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "But it contained one element that troubles me greatly. If Vivian was safely removed to prevent a disastrous marriage, where is she now? And why has she not communicated her safety to those who love her?" For the first time since the crisis began, genuine terror appeared in Mrs. Ashworth's eyes. Her carefully maintained facade crumbled completely as she whispered, "She was to contact me within 12 hours of the ceremony. We arranged a simple code, a telegram about her safe arrival at a predetermined location, but there has been no word, no message of any kind." The silence that followed this admission was profound and chilling. What had appeared to be a resolved mystery had suddenly acquired a new and far more sinister dimension. If Vivian Ashworth had willingly participated in her own disappearance, then her continued absence suggested that the protective plan had gone catastrophically wrong. Poirot rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man whose understanding of the case had just undergone a fundamental transformation. "Madame," he said quietly, "I fear that what you intended as salvation may have delivered your stepdaughter into far greater danger than the marriage you sought to prevent. Someone has taken advantage of your carefully laid plans for purposes of their own, and we must now consider the possibility that Miss Ashworth has become the victim of a crime far more serious than mere disappearance." The implications of this realization settled over the room like a shroud, transforming what had seemed like a clever rescue into something approaching tragedy. The bride in the black carriage had not simply vanished through elaborate deception. She had been made to disappear by someone who understood both the protective plan and how to exploit it for their own dark purposes. The transformation in Mrs. Ashworth was immediate and devastating. The composed matron who had maintained such remarkable poise throughout the crisis collapsed into herself, her carefully controlled facade crumbling to reveal a woman consumed by terror for her stepdaughter's safety. Her hands shook as she reached for her handkerchief, her voice breaking as she attempted to explain the predetermined signals that should have confirmed Vivian's well-being. The telegram was to read simply, "Weather delightful in Dorset," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Such an innocent phrase, but it would have told me she had reached the cottage safely. We arranged for her to stay there until proper evidence could be presented against Thornfield's true character. Poirot's response to this revelation was swift and methodical. Rather than offering false comfort, he immediately focused on the practical elements that might lead to Vivian's recovery. "The rendezvous point, madame. You will describe it to me with absolute precision. Every detail may prove crucial." Mrs. Ashworth's account revealed a secluded lane approximately 2 miles from the church, where the road curved sharply through a wooded area known locally as Bride's Wood. The location had been chosen specifically because the following motor cars would be momentarily out of sight during the turn, providing perhaps 30 seconds for the exchange to occur unobserved. "The motor car was hired through my late husband's solicitor, Mr. Pembroke," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she focused on practical details. "A reliable dark sedan with a driver I trusted implicitly. They were to wait precisely at the bend where the hedgerow provides natural concealment. Within the hour, Poirot had organized a reconstruction of the wedding procession with Inspector Pierce's cooperation. The black carriage was once again positioned at the church, the same horses harnessed, and several motor cars arranged in their original formation. Poirot chose a seat in the first following vehicle, his watch in hand, and his keen gaze alert to every nuance of the route. As they proceeded along the winding road, I observed Poirot's intense concentration on the landscape. Twice during wooded turns, the carriage disappeared from view for brief moments, but at Brideswood, the concealment extended longer, the black coach slipping into a natural pocket where ancient hedgerows swelled and the crown of the road curved between gentle hollows. At Poirot's direction, the carriage maintained the measured pace described by all witnesses. When they reached the designated spot, he immediately stepped out and began his examination of the area with that meticulous attention that had made his reputation throughout Europe. "Observe, Inspector," he murmured, crouching near the verge where the lane widened slightly. His delicate fingers traced a shallow impression in the dust, the unmistakable mark of a motor car that had waited in precisely this location. "The tire pattern is distinctive, and here." He indicated a dark stain on the road surface, raising his finger to his nose after touching it. "Motor oil, but not the common variety. This speaks of a high-performance engine, one maintained with considerable care." Further examination revealed additional evidence that painted an increasingly sinister picture. A fragment of dark fabric clung to a blackthorn branch at exactly the height where someone might have caught their clothing while moving quickly between vehicles. On the carriage step itself, Poirot discovered faint scratches that suggested hasty or forceful contact, and within the carriage, the door frame bore traces of that same theatrical adhesive, now partially disturbed as if by struggle. "The exchange did occur," Poirot announced with grim certainty, "but not as planned. Someone with knowledge of the arrangement intercepted Mademoiselle Vivienne at this very spot." Our return to Thornfield Manor was conducted in contemplative silence, each revelation adding weight to the growing realization that what had begun as a protective deception had been transformed into something far more dangerous. Poirot's first action upon arrival was to examine the motor house, where several vehicles stood in orderly arrangement. Mr. Thornfield's Daimler showed no signs of recent use beyond its documented journey to the church. However, Mr. Whitmore's Sunbeam, a sleek grey machine with an air of barely contained power, immediately captured Poirot's attention. A faint smear of road dust on the right running board contained traces of the distinctive oil he had found at the rendezvous point, and the forward edge bore a fresh scrape that had been hastily touched up with paint. When questioned about his movements during the crucial period, Whitmore maintained his earlier account with perhaps too much precision. "I remained at the manor throughout the afternoon," he insisted, though his manner had acquired a defensive quality that had not been present during his initial interview. "The motor has not been used since my arrival this morning." Poirot's gentle testing of the engine bonnet revealed the telltale warmth of recent operation, despite Whitmore's claims. More significantly, inquiry at the local garage confirmed that the Sunbeam had indeed been serviced at noon precisely, requiring fuel and minor adjustments that suggested recent hard driving. The confrontation with Whitmore took place in the manor's study, where the businessman had established himself with ledgers and correspondence. His earlier clinical detachment had given way to obvious tension, though he maintained his professional demeanor even when faced with the mounting evidence. "Mr. Whitmore," Poirot began without preamble, "your business partnership with Mr. Thornfield involves certain financial arrangements that would be significantly affected by the failure of his marriage, does it not?" Whitmore's response revealed the complex web of financial interests that had transformed Mrs. Ashworth's protective plan into a trap. The marriage represented not merely personal happiness, but substantial business advantages, including access to the Ashworth textile fortune and the resolution of certain irregularities in the Thornfield firm's accounts. "Dorothy Ashworth came to me with her financial difficulties," Whitmore admitted with growing reluctance. She possessed knowledge of family secrets that proved useful in understanding the true situation. When she revealed her stepmother's plan, I realized that immediate action was necessary to protect legitimate business interests. As the full scope of Whitmore's involvement began to emerge, a telegraph boy arrived at the front door with a message addressed to Mrs. Ashworth. The telegram bore the agreed-upon code, "Weather delightful in Dorset, cottage perfect." Mrs. Ashworth cried out with relief, clutching the paper to her breast, but Poirot's sharp eyes immediately detected the deception. "Madame," he said gently, taking the telegram with careful attention to its details, "observe the postmark timing, which contradicts the schedule of events. Notice also the formation of the letters, which differs subtly from your stepdaughter's natural hand. Someone wishes you to believe all is well at the precise moment when we have most reason to fear the opposite." The realization that even this apparent good news was false struck Mrs. Ashworth like a physical blow. The silence that followed was profound and chilling, broken only by the distant sound of search parties calling Vivian's name across the darkening estate grounds. "I fear, mes amis," Poirot announced with grave solemnity, "that we are no longer investigating a disappearance, but something far more serious. Mademoiselle Vivienne has fallen into the hands of someone who possesses both intimate knowledge of the family's affairs and the ruthless determination to exploit them. Time is now our enemy, and we must act with all possible speed if we are to prevent this elaborate deception from becoming a tragedy." The bride in the black carriage had not simply vanished through clever staging. She had been deliberately diverted from safety into circumstances that grew more ominous with each passing hour. What had begun as an impossible mystery was revealing itself as a calculated crime, and the game had suddenly become a race against time to save a life that hung in the balance. The false telegram lay before Poirot like an accusation, its deceptive message a stark reminder that somewhere in the gathering darkness, Vivian Ashworth remained in mortal danger. His response was immediate and methodical, dispatching Inspector Pierce to the village telegraph office while he himself placed an urgent call to Mr. Pembroke, the family solicitor who had arranged the protective rendezvous. Pembroke's voice carried genuine alarm across the telephone connection. The hired driver, Alfred Keats, had failed to report his safe arrival at the Dorset cottage as arranged, nor had he returned the motor car to the London agency. Most unlike him, Pembroke insisted with the precision of a man who prided himself on reliable arrangements. "Keats has been in my employ for occasional services these past 3 years. His punctuality and discretion are beyond question." Inspector Pierce's return from the telegraph office brought confirmation of Poirot's suspicions. The message had been dispatched from Cheltenham by a gentleman matching Whitmore's description, complete to the grey Homburg hat that several witnesses recalled from the morning's wedding festivities. The clerk remembered the sender's measured speech and his casual remark about sparing the lady further distress, details that spoke of someone intimately familiar with the family's circumstances. The discovery of the missing driver came through the sharp eyes of a farm boy who reported a motor car concealed in the old Tithe barn near Mill Brook. Our journey there revealed Alfred Keats bound and gagged behind a stack of hurdles, weakened by his ordeal, but conscious enough to provide a coherent account of his assault. "A constable stopped me near Bishop's Gate," Keats explained after accepting a measure of brandy to steady his voice. "Showed proper identification, spoke of routine checks on hired vehicles. When I stepped down to open the boot for inspection, something struck me from behind. I remember nothing more until I woke in this wretched place." Poirot's examination of the scene yielded evidence that connected directly to his earlier discoveries. The gag bore traces of that distinctive violet perfume, while the adhesive tape showed the same brown residue found at the church. Most significantly, tire impressions in the barn's earthen floor matched exactly the pattern observed at Bride's Wood, confirming that the same vehicle had been used for both the interception and the driver's imprisonment. The constable's uniform was theatrical costume, Poirot announced after examining fragments of brass buttons that Keats remembered noticing. The badgework shows the imperfections of stage property rather than official manufacture. Someone with access to such materials has orchestrated this elaborate deception. Our return to Thornfield Manor found the household in a state of barely controlled tension. Whitmore's earlier composure had cracked completely under the weight of mounting evidence, his professional demeanor replaced by the desperate calculations of a man whose carefully laid plans were unraveling. When confronted with Keats's testimony and the physical evidence from the barn, his resistance collapsed entirely. The marriage would have destroyed everything, he confessed, his voice hollow with defeat. Thornfield's business irregularities, the loans secured against expectations of the Ashworth fortune, the investments made in anticipation of the merger. When Dorothy revealed her stepmother's plan, I saw an opportunity to prevent disaster. The full scope of the conspiracy emerged through Whitmore's reluctant admissions and Dorothy's own tearful confessions when faced with irrefutable evidence of her complicity. The younger Ashworth sister had provided detailed intelligence about family arrangements while supplying the theatrical materials necessary for the elaborate deception. Her failed stage venture had left her not only financially desperate, but also equipped with precisely the specialized knowledge required to execute such an intricate fraud. "I never intended harm to Vivian," Dorothy insisted, though her words carried the hollow ring of rationalization. "We planned only to delay the marriage until proper evidence could be presented about Reginald's true character. But when she refused to cooperate at the rendezvous, when she threatened to expose everything immediately, circumstances forced more drastic measures. The location where Vivian was being held emerged through patient questioning and careful cross-examination of the conspirators' accounts. A remote cottage near Little Wickham, owned by a theatrical colleague of Dorothy's, had been prepared as a temporary prison while the conspirators decided how to resolve their increasingly desperate situation. Inspector Pierce organized the rescue operation with military precision, surrounding the cottage while Poirot approached the front door with characteristic deliberation. The silence that greeted their arrival was profound and somehow ominous, broken only by the distant sound of search parties calling across the darkening countryside. The cottage door stood unlocked, revealing a scene that struck fear into every heart present. Signs of recent habitation were everywhere. Cold tea in delicate cups, a woman's traveling cloak draped across a chair, scattered papers that spoke of hasty departure. More disturbing were the obvious indicators of struggle: an overturned lamp, displaced furniture, and what appeared to be drops of blood on the worn carpet near the fireplace. "Mademoiselle Vivienne," Poirot called into the oppressive silence, "we are here to assist you." The response came as a faint tapping from somewhere above, rhythmic and desperate. The narrow staircase led to a small bedroom whose door had been secured from the outside with a recently installed bolt. When Inspector Pierce forced the barrier, they discovered not Vivian, but Dorothy Ashworth, bound to a chair with silk scarves and gagged with a cloth that bore the now familiar scent of violets. Her release revealed a story that added yet another dimension to the bewildering case. "She overpowered me yesterday evening," Dorothy gasped, her voice breaking with genuine terror. Vivian had seemed to accept her situation, had even begun discussing terms for her eventual release. But when I brought her evening meal, she struck me with a candlestick and escaped in the motor car. This revelation transformed the entire nature of their search. Rather than rescuing a helpless victim, they were now pursuing a young woman who had taken control of her own fate and disappeared with purposes that none of them could predict or control. The bride in the black carriage had evolved from vanishing victim to active participant in a drama whose final act remained unwritten. "Inspector," Poirot announced with grave concern, "we are no longer seeking a kidnapped bride, but a young woman who believes herself betrayed by everyone she trusted. In such circumstances, the actions of even the most rational person can become unpredictable and dangerous." As they prepared to expand the search, a messenger arrived with news that sent a chill through the entire party. Vivian had been observed that morning in Millbrook Cross, making inquiries about Thornfield Manor and asking specific questions about which wedding guests remained in residence. The bride was returning, but not as the radiant young woman who had disappeared from the sealed carriage. She was coming back as someone with knowledge of every deception practiced in her name, and with 24 hours of imprisonment and betrayal to fuel whatever plans she had conceived for those who had manipulated her fate. The mystery of the bride in the black carriage was approaching its climax, but the resolution promised to be far more complex and perilous than any of them had anticipated. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Vivian Ashworth moved with purposes known only to herself, carrying secrets that could destroy reputations and perhaps lives. The game had evolved beyond mere detection into something approaching a race against time to prevent a tragedy born of betrayal and revenge. The urgency of Vivian's imminent return galvanized Poirot into immediate action, his response combining the methodical precision that had made his reputation with an understanding of human psychology that bordered on the supernatural. Rather than attempting to intercept her approach, he chose to control the circumstances of their inevitable confrontation by transforming Thornfield Manor into a carefully orchestrated stage where truth could finally emerge from the shadows of deception. "Inspector Pierce," he announced with quiet authority, "you will position your men at strategic points around the estate, but they must remain unobtrusive. Mademoiselle Vivienne returns to us not as a victim seeking rescue, but as someone who has discovered the full extent of the betrayals practiced in her name. In such circumstances, the actions of even the most rational person can become unpredictable." His first priority was a private interview with Mr. Thornfield, who arrived pale and exhausted, carrying himself with the air of a man who had lost not merely a wife, but his fundamental understanding of the world around him. Under Poirot's gentle but relentless questioning, the bridegroom's carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. The financial irregularities began 18 months ago, Thornfield confessed, producing a bundle of documents from his inner pocket with hands that trembled visibly. Whitmore assured me the situation could be remedied after the marriage, when certain lines of credit would open through the Ashworth connection. I intended to tell Vivian everything after the ceremony, to make it clear that I would not touch a penny of her inheritance without her explicit consent. Poirot examined the papers with rapid precision, his green eyes noting details that spoke of systematic deception extending far beyond mere business difficulties. "Yet you chose not to inform Mademoiselle Vivienne before the marriage, when such honesty might have prevented this entire catastrophe." I feared she would break the engagement and that the resulting scandal would destroy both our families. Thornfield replied, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. "It was cowardice, pure and simple. But I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, whatever else may have been false, my love for her was genuine." The positioning of the other parties required equal care and psychological insight. Mrs. Ashworth was placed in the library where her composure could be observed, while Dorothy remained under discreet supervision in the morning room. Miss Darnley, whose romantic feelings for Thornfield had added another layer of complexity to the web of deception, was stationed where she could serve as a potential mediator if circumstances required. The first indication of Vivian's approach came through reports from the estate's perimeter guards. A motor car matching the description of the stolen vehicle had been observed making careful circuits of the manor's grounds, its solitary occupant apparently conducting systematic reconnaissance of the building's defenses and the positions of the constables. "She comes not as a frightened refugee," Poirot observed with growing concern, "but as someone who has had 24 hours to analyze her situation and formulate a plan of action. In such circumstances, we must be prepared for anything." When Vivian finally approached the manor directly, she did so with a boldness that caught even Poirot by surprise. Rather than attempting stealth or seeking a hidden entrance, she drove straight to the main door and stepped from the motor car with the bearing of someone who had come to settle accounts. Her transformation was immediately apparent to all who observed her arrival. The radiant bride of the previous morning had been replaced by a young woman whose beauty had acquired a hard edge that spoke of bitter experience and newfound determination. Her wedding dress had been abandoned for practical traveling clothes, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had discovered reserves of strength she had never known she possessed. "Good afternoon," she announced as she entered the drawing room, her voice carrying a quality that made everyone present shift uncomfortably. "I trust you have all been enjoying the wedding reception in my absence." The silence that greeted this observation was profound and somehow terrible. Each person present found themselves unable to meet her direct gaze, the weight of their individual guilt rendering them speechless before her quiet accusation. Poirot alone remained composed, rising to greet her with elaborate courtesy. "Mademoiselle Vivienne, we have been most concerned for your safety. Your disappearance has caused considerable distress to all who care for you." Her laugh held no trace of humor. "How touching to discover such concern, Monsieur Poirot. Though I confess I find it remarkable that so many people could care so deeply while simultaneously conspiring to deceive me about every aspect of my own wedding day." As she moved through the room with deliberate precision, cataloguing each person's individual betrayals, it became increasingly clear that her hours of captivity had been spent not in despair, but in careful analysis. Her understanding of the financial motivations, personal jealousies, and misguided protectiveness that had combined to create the elaborate deception was both comprehensive and devastatingly accurate. The confrontation that followed revealed depths of psychological complexity that even Poirot had not fully anticipated. Vivienne's methodical examination of each conspirator's motives demonstrated a mind that had been sharpened by betrayal into an instrument of remarkable clarity and purpose. Yet it was precisely at the moment when resolution seemed within reach that the evening took its most dramatic turn. A sharp report echoed from the study, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy fall. The assembled company rushed toward the noise to discover Mr. Whitmore lying motionless near the fireplace, a revolver fallen just beyond his reach, and the unmistakable scent of violets hanging in the air near an open window. As Inspector Pierce confirmed what was already obvious to all present, Poirot's expression grew grave with the realization that their carefully orchestrated confrontation had been transformed into something far more serious. The bride in the black carriage had indeed returned, but her homecoming had coincided with an act of violence that would require all his legendary skills to unravel. The mystery that had begun with an impossible disappearance had evolved into something approaching tragedy, and the final act promised revelations that none of them could have anticipated. The immediate aftermath of Whitmore's death transformed the drawing room into a scene of barely controlled chaos, with Inspector Pierce taking charge with admirable efficiency, while Poirot observed the reactions of each individual with that penetrating gaze that missed nothing. The sound of the gunshot had shattered whatever fragile equilibrium had existed between the assembled parties, replacing it with the stark reality that their elaborate deceptions had culminated in actual violence. Poirot's approach to the crime scene demonstrated the methodical precision that had made his reputation throughout Europe. Rather than rushing to examine the body, he first secured the room's integrity, noting the position of every piece of furniture, the angle of the fallen revolver, and most significantly, the lingering scent of violets that seemed to mock their previous investigations with its persistent presence. "Inspector Pierce," he announced with quiet authority, "you will observe that our Mr. Whitmore has arranged his final scene with considerable attention to dramatic effect. The open window, the scattered papers, the convenient positioning of the weapon all speak of someone who understood the importance of creating the proper impression." His examination of the study revealed details that challenged the obvious conclusion of suicide. The window, while indeed open, showed no disturbance of the dust on its exterior sill, effectively ruling out escape by that route. More tellingly, the papers scattered across Whitmore's desk proved to be a partially completed confession, written in a hand that grew increasingly agitated with each line, as if the writer had been struggling against both time and conscience. The source of the persistent violet fragrance was discovered beneath the desk in the form of a small crystal vial, deliberately broken to release its contents. Poirot examined the fragments with particular attention, noting that the perfume was of exceptional quality, the type favored by women of refined taste and considerable means. The theatrical nature of this detail was not lost on him, suggesting someone with knowledge of stagecraft and the psychology of misdirection. "Observe, mes amis," Poirot announced to the assembled company, "how our mysterious violet lady has once again left her calling card. But this time, the scent serves not to conceal identity but to direct our attention toward a particular conclusion. Someone wishes us to believe that the same person who orchestrated the carriage deception has now silenced Mr. Whitmore permanently." The questioning of the household revealed alibis that were perhaps too perfect in their precision. Mrs. Ashworth had remained in the library throughout the crucial period, her presence confirmed by the housemaid who had been arranging flowers nearby. Dorothy claimed to have been in her room, overcome by the emotional strain of the day's revelations. Miss Darnley had stepped onto the terrace for fresh air, her distress at the confrontation having triggered one of her periodic headaches. Yet it was Vivian's account that proved most intriguing in its careful construction. She described her final confrontation with Whitmore in terms that suggested intimate knowledge of his financial irregularities and the full scope of his manipulation of the family's affairs. Her anger, she claimed, had been so intense that she had left the study immediately to prevent herself from saying something she might regret. "He was writing when I left him," she explained with that same controlled composure that had marked all her interactions since her return. Scribbling frantically, as if trying to set down everything before his courage failed him, I assumed it was another of his elaborate justifications for his criminal behavior. Poirot's discovery of a partially burned telegram in the fireplace grate provided the evening's most significant clue. The fragment bore the familiar postmark from Cheltenham and part of the message that had been used to deceive Mrs. Ashworth about her stepdaughter's safety. The timing of its destruction suggested that Whitmore had been attempting to eliminate evidence of his involvement in the deception when he was interrupted by his killer. The psychological implications of the crime scene arrangement were not lost on Poirot's analytical mind. The staging suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Whitmore's character and habits, someone who understood that his death would be readily accepted as suicide by a man whose schemes had finally collapsed around him. Yet the very perfection of this arrangement spoke to careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Miss Darnley's revelation about the violet perfume provided a crucial insight that reframed much of their previous investigation. "Vivian wore that particular scent during our school days," she admitted reluctantly when pressed about the recurring fragrance. "It was her signature before she adopted the orange blossom that everyone associates with her now. Only someone with intimate knowledge of her past would have chosen violets to create a false trail." This information cast new light on the mysterious figure who had been manipulating events throughout the case. Rather than being an unknown antagonist, the evidence suggested someone with deep personal knowledge of all the participants, someone who understood not only their current circumstances, but their histories and hidden vulnerabilities. As the evening progressed, Poirot's reconstruction of events began to reveal a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond the wedding day itself. The anonymous letters, the choice of the funeral carriage, the timing of various revelations, all appeared to be elements in a larger design conceived by someone who had been observing and planning for considerable time. "The truth, mes amis," Poirot announced as he prepared to dismiss the assembled company, "lies not in the obvious conclusions that have been so carefully arranged for our consumption, but in the psychology of revenge and the terrible clarity that comes to those who discover they have been betrayed by everyone they trusted." Inspector Pierce's arrangements for the evening included discreet surveillance of all parties, as Poirot had made it clear that the case was approaching its climax. The death of Whitmore had eliminated one source of information while potentially creating new dangers for those who remained. Someone among them possessed knowledge that was worth killing to protect, and that same someone might not hesitate to act again if circumstances required. As the household settled into an uneasy night, the black carriage stood in the drive like an accusation against the gathering darkness. The bride who had vanished from its confines had returned, but not as the innocent victim everyone had expected. She had come back as someone who understood the full scope of the betrayals practiced in her name, and the evening's violence suggested that her response to these revelations was far from complete. The mystery of the bride in the black carriage was entering its final phase, but the resolution promised to be more complex and morally ambiguous than any of them had anticipated. Justice and revenge had become so intertwined that separating them would require all of Poirot's legendary wisdom and understanding of the darkest corners of the human heart. The house settled into an uneasy quiet that spoke more of exhaustion than peace, and Poirot used these precious hours of solitude to conduct the methodical analysis that had made his reputation throughout Europe. He returned to the study with Inspector Pierce, requesting that nothing be disturbed until his examination was complete. The scene that greeted them bore all the hallmarks of careful staging, yet it was precisely in this theatrical perfection that Poirot detected the first threads of truth. His examination of the writing desk revealed details that challenged the obvious conclusion of suicide. The blotting pad, when held to the stopper light, showed imprints of previous writing that included partial words and a distinctive capital D that trailed off abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. The fountain pen's nib showed wear patterns consistent with right-handed use, yet the smear of ink on Whitmore's left cuff suggested the awkwardness of someone guiding another's hand through the final, fatal composition. The lingering scent of violets drew his attention to a more subtle discovery. Beneath the windowsill, he found not perfume itself, but violet-tinted talc, a theatrical trick used to prolong fragrance in closed spaces. Someone had dressed the air with the same deliberate care that an actress brings to preparing a stage, and the hasty application suggested work done under pressure of time. "Inspector Pierce," Poirot murmured as he examined the partially burned telegram in the fireplace. "Observe how our mysterious violet lady has once again left her calling card. But this time, the scent serves not to conceal identity, but to direct our attention toward a predetermined conclusion. Someone wishes us to believe that the same person who orchestrated the carriage deception has now silenced Mr. Whitmore permanently." The morning brought a series of small revelations that, when properly arranged, began to form a picture of devastating clarity. The footman admitted that Miss Dorothy had requested smelling salts at precisely the quarter hour before the fatal shot, then dismissed him with unusual haste. The housemaid, though reluctant to speak against her betters, confessed that Miss Darnley had returned from the terrace wearing a shawl that carried the distinctive violet fragrance, as if it had been worn in a closed space where the scent could concentrate. Poirot's examination of Dorothy's room revealed a collection of items that spoke eloquently of theatrical deception. A sewing kit contained adhesive of the type used in stage productions, while a length of black ribbon showed the telltale stiffening of the same gummy substance. Most significantly, a tiny brass device shaped like a constable's badge had been carefully filed to remove any identifying marks, suggesting its use in the elaborate charade that had deceived the hired driver. Yet it was his analysis of the silk scarves that had bound Dorothy at the cottage that provided the most revealing evidence. The fabric showed no signs of genuine strain, and the knots were of the classical slip configuration favored in amateur dramatics. The wrist abrasions were lateral rather than circumferential, clearly sustained after the fact when she had demonstrated her bonds to her rescuers. The performance had been designed for sympathetic observation, complete to her theatrical plea that the bonds be untied rather than cut, ensuring the knots could be properly admired. When Poirot gathered the household for what he announced would be the final discussion of the case, the atmosphere in the drawing room was electric with tension. Each person entered with the careful movements of someone who understood that long-buried secrets were about to be exposed to merciless scrutiny. The black carriage remained visible through the tall windows, a silent witness to the elaborate deception that had begun with a bride's disappearance and culminated in murder. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the measured authority of absolute certainty, "we have before us a case of extraordinary complexity, where protective love and vengeful obsession have become so intertwined that separating them requires the most careful analysis. The disappearance of Mademoiselle Vivienne was indeed accomplished through ingenious mechanical means, but the true genius of this crime lay not in its execution, but in its psychological conception. His reconstruction revealed layers of manipulation that extended far beyond the wedding day itself. The anonymous letters had been crafted not merely to create doubt about the marriage, but to establish a pattern of mysterious threats that would provide cover for more serious actions. The choice of the funeral carriage had been deliberate psychological manipulation, designed to plant seeds of unease that would make the subsequent disappearance more believable. "Mrs. Ashworth," Poirot continued, his gaze settling on the woman who had maintained such remarkable composure throughout the crisis, "your maternal instincts were genuine and admirable, but they were also expertly manipulated by someone who understood both your character and your deepest fears. The financial irregularities you discovered about Mr. Thornfield were real, but they were presented to you at precisely the right moment and in precisely the right context to ensure your cooperation. The revelation that followed struck the assembled company with devastating force. The documents that had convinced Mrs. Ashworth of Thornfield's unsuitability had been carefully selected from a larger collection that told a more complex story. While the financial difficulties were genuine, they had been deliberately exacerbated by systematic sabotage designed to create the very crisis that justified intervention. Someone with intimate access to the Thornfield firm's records had been manipulating the situation for months," Poirot explained, his analysis revealing a pattern of calculated destruction that spoke to long-term planning and extraordinary patience. The goal was not merely to prevent this particular marriage, but to destroy Mr. Thornfield's reputation and financial standing so completely that no recovery would be possible. As his methodical reconstruction continued, connecting each piece of evidence to its proper place in the larger pattern, I observed the faces of those assembled with growing fascination. Mrs. Ashworth's expression showed dawning horror as she realized the extent to which she had been manipulated. Dorothy's terror had given way to something approaching relief, as if the burden of her secrets was finally being lifted. Mr. Thornfield listened with the stunned attention of a man discovering that his entire world had been built on foundations of sand. But it was Miss Darnley's reaction that proved most telling. Where the others showed surprise, confusion, or fear, her face displayed the terrible composure of someone who had been expecting this moment and had prepared herself to meet it with whatever dignity remained to her. "The identity of our manipulator," Poirot announced, his voice carrying a note of profound sadness, "emerges not from the obvious evidence that has been so carefully arranged for our consumption, but from the psychology of obsession and the terrible clarity that comes to those who believe themselves invisible in plain sight." The silence that followed was profound and somehow final, as if the very air in the room had been charged with the electricity of approaching revelation. The bride in the black carriage had been saved, but the cost of that salvation was about to be revealed in all its tragic complexity. The game that had begun with an impossible disappearance was approaching its climax, and the resolution promised to challenge every assumption about guilt, innocence, and the price of unrequited devotion. The silence in the drawing room stretched like a taut wire, each person present acutely aware that they stood at the threshold of revelation. Poirot allowed the tension to build with the practiced timing of a master conductor, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face before settling with devastating finality upon Miss Celia Darnley. "Mademoiselle Darnley," he began, his voice carrying that peculiar blend of gentleness and inexorable authority that had unmasked so many criminals before her, You have orchestrated perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated deception of my career. Your performance as the devoted friend has been flawless, but it is precisely in that perfection that you have revealed yourself. The effect of these words was immediate and profound. Where the others in the room showed surprise or confusion, Celia's face displayed the terrible composure of someone who had been expecting this moment and had steeled herself to meet it with whatever dignity remained to her. Poirot's reconstruction began with methodical precision, each piece of evidence falling into place with the inevitability of a well-constructed puzzle. The violet perfume that has haunted this case from the beginning was your signature, mademoiselle, but not in the way you intended. You chose violets because they pointed simultaneously toward Mademoiselle Vivienne, who favored this scent in her school days, and toward Madame Caroline, who might plausibly have revived it in memory. But only you possessed the intimate knowledge of Vivienne's girlhood preferences, combined with the calculating mind necessary to use such knowledge as misdirection. His analysis revealed layers of manipulation that extended far beyond the wedding day itself. Celia had systematically undermined Thornfield's business relationships while maintaining the facade of loyal friendship, creating the very financial crisis that she then used to justify intervention. Her position as trusted family friend had provided access to confidential correspondence, opportunities to plant evidence, and the ability to gradually poison every relationship that might have supported the marriage. You authored the anonymous letters, not merely to create doubt, but to establish a pattern of mysterious threats that would provide cover for more elaborate deceptions. When Mrs. Ashworth came to you with her concerns, you fed her carefully selected documents that painted Mr. Thornfield in the worst possible light, knowing that her protective instincts would compel her to act. The sealed carriage ceremony was your suggestion, conveyed through Dorothy's innocent enthusiasm for theatrical traditions. The violation of trust went deeper still. Celia had exploited Dorothy's financial desperation and theatrical knowledge, manipulating the younger woman into providing the technical expertise necessary for the elaborate fraud. Her understanding of each family member's psychology had enabled her to predict and control their responses with surgical precision. Your plan required Vivienne's cooperation in her own disappearance, which you achieved by presenting her with fabricated evidence of Thornfield's betrayal on the morning of the wedding. But when she escaped from the cottage and threatened to expose the entire deception, you realized that more permanent measures were necessary. The murder of Whitmore had been accomplished with the same theatrical precision that marked all of Celia's actions. Her knowledge of his guilt and growing desperation had provided the opportunity, while her understanding of stagecraft had enabled her to create a convincing suicide scene. The violet perfume scattered through the study had been her final misdirection, designed to point suspicion toward Vivienne herself. You intended that suspicion would fall upon Vivienne, driven mad by betrayal and seeking revenge against all who had deceived her. The scattered clues, the theatrical staging, even your own apparent distress throughout the crisis, all served to create a narrative where the bride in the black carriage had returned as an avenging fury. As Poirot's analysis continued, revealing each calculated deception and psychological manipulation, Celia's carefully maintained mask finally began to crack. The devoted friend who had seemed so concerned for everyone's welfare stood revealed as someone whose obsession had transformed love into a weapon of extraordinary destructive power. But you made one crucial error, mademoiselle. Your performance was too perfect, your knowledge too complete, your reactions too precisely calibrated. The groundskeeper's description of the mysterious lady at the church matched your height, and bearing exactly. The theatrical adhesive found at multiple crime scenes came from supplies you had access to through Dorothy's failed stage venture. Most tellingly, the housemaid detected the concentrated scent of violets in your shawl after you claimed to have been on the terrace during Whitmore's death. Inspector Pierce stepped forward as Poirot concluded his exposition, but Celia raised her hand with a gesture of quiet dignity that commanded respect even in defeat. "You need not explain further, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. "Your analysis is correct in every particular. I loved Reginald Thornfield with a devotion that consumed everything else in my life, and when it became clear that he would never return that love, I convinced myself that destroying his happiness was preferable to allowing him to find it with someone else." Her confession revealed the full scope of her obsession and the terrible logic that had driven her to such extremes. I told myself I was protecting him from a disastrous marriage, saving him from financial ruin, preserving him from scandal. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I could not bear to see him happy with another woman, and if I could not have him, I was determined that no one else should. The aftermath of the revelation brought its own complex emotions to the assembled company. Mrs. Ashworth wept openly for her stepdaughter and for her own unwitting role in the deception, while Dorothy faced the prospect of criminal charges for her complicity in the conspiracy. Mr. Thornfield, his name cleared but his heart broken by the scope of the betrayal, announced his intention to make full restitution for any financial irregularities and to rebuild his business on foundations of absolute honesty. Vivienne herself received the news with that same controlled composure that had marked her return from captivity. "I suspected someone close to us was involved," she admitted quietly to Poirot as the others dealt with the practical consequences of the revelation. "There were too many coincidences, too many convenient discoveries, but I never imagined the depth of her obsession or the lengths to which she would go to possess what she could never have." As Inspector Pierce led Celia away, her final words revealed the tragic delusion that had driven her to such extremes. "He would have been happy with me," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of years of unrequited devotion. "I understood him as she never could. Everything I did was for love, even if that love had become something terrible." The black carriage was returned to Dayson's son the following morning, its role in the elaborate deception finally concluded. As I watched it disappear down the country lane, I reflected on the terrible irony that what had been intended as a symbol of protection and tradition had become the centerpiece of a drama that nearly destroyed everyone it was meant to safeguard. Poirot's final observation, delivered as we departed Thornfield Manor for the last time, carried the weight of hard-won wisdom about the complexities of human nature. "The greatest crimes, mon ami, are not those committed by strangers in dark alleys, but by those who claim to love us and use that love as justification for the most terrible betrayals." Miss Darnley's devotion was genuine, but it was a devotion that had become poisoned by its own intensity, transformed from a force of creation into an instrument of destruction. As our train pulled away from Millbrook Cross Station, carrying us back to London and leaving behind the scene of so much deception and tragedy, I found myself thinking of Vivienne Ashworth and the remarkable strength she had shown in the face of such comprehensive betrayal. The bride in the black carriage had indeed vanished on her wedding day, but she had returned as someone far stronger and wiser than the innocent young woman who had stepped into that fateful conveyance. The case was closed, justice had been served, and yet I knew that for all involved, the true healing would take far longer than any legal proceedings. Some mysteries, once solved, leave scars that time alone can heal, and the affair of the bride in the black carriage would remain forever etched in the memories of those who witnessed its terrible unfolding. Hercule Poirot settled back in his railway compartment with a small sigh, his famous moustaches perfectly groomed despite the emotional toll of the case. "And so," he murmured as the English countryside rolled past our window, "we discover once again that the human heart remains the most complex mystery of all, one that defies even the most careful analysis. Love, when it becomes obsession, can drive even the most rational mind to acts of desperate folly. The little gray cells, they can solve the puzzle of how a crime was committed, but the why? That belongs to the deeper mysteries of human nature itself." With that philosophical reflection, The great detective closed his eyes and allowed himself the luxury of rest, secure in the knowledge that another impossible mystery had been resolved through the application of logic, psychology, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, however painful that truth might prove to be.